Hello once again, everybody, at Vintage Iron Range Dirt Track Racing. Today I am joined by Dave Vesel of Hibbing. Dave, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Dave, I understand this fall you had some health issues. Had like a heart attack.
Yes,
which
sir.
is not good at all, but you seem to be doing quite well. You're back to work now.
Back to work.
How did they fix your heart attack?
They put a few stents in me.
Oh yeah, and then maybe a couple new grease fittings and
A couple of zerts on the side.
and sent you on your way.
There you
Huh?
go.
Okay, Dave, how did you get interested in dirt track racing?
I got interested through my brother Steve and my father. My father raced in the early 50s, and my brother Steve started in the late or early 70s, and it kind of struck my interest.
So did you serve as a pitman then for Steve for a while?
I believe I helped a couple times on his car. I was living in Los Angeles the majority of the 70s and moved back to Minnesota in the late 70s. So that's when I started taking an interest in it.
Okay. Do you remember anything about your dad's racing days?
No, nothing other than pictures that I saw of his car. And
So you were quite young, or maybe not even born when he raced?
when he raced, I don't believe I was even born
Okay.
when he raced.
But I do remember your dad was a fixture up in the grandstands every Saturday night.
Both my parents were, yes.
Henry, known as, everybody called him Hank, but yeah.
And my grandmother was up in the stands, and my grandfather.
So you had quite a section of family and friends up in the grandstands, and
Yes, we did.
during you and your brother's racing days. You raced for several years, and then you were a car owner for several years. But first, we're just going to focus on your driving days. Do you remember what year did you start driving?
I started driving in 1980.
Okay. What made you decide to stop helping and being at the track and actually become a race car driver?
I pretty much was a owner driver my whole time that I was at the racetrack. I didn't pit very often for my brother Steve when I started, and he had his team already made, and I started my own team, and that was some friends and relatives that helped me out.
So you really started to become a regular then once you actually had a car and were driving.
Correct.
Okay. Do you remember how many years total did you drive?
I believe I drove for 7 years.
In
6 years or 7 years.
In 6 cylinders and a late model, right?
I drove, I believe it was 5 or 6 years in 6 cylinders and 1 year in late models.
Okay. Now you were always number 5, both as a driver and a car owner.
Number 05.
05.
Yes.
How did you pick that number?
I picked that number because my birthday is all fives. And that's why I picked that number.
55.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, your 6 cylinders, you started like with a 72 Nova.
Started with a 72 Nova with a 250 cubic inch 6-cylinder.
And then you went up to like a 75 Nova.
Then I went from a 72 to a 75 Nova.
Was that 75 a better car?
75 was a much better car, yeah.
Lighter, handled better? Or what?
I believe it was a little wider stance,
Okay.
and it handled a little better. It had a little better steering boxes.
Okay.
And
Now, those first couple Novas of yours, they were always baby blue.
all my first cars were
Was
baby
there
blue.
any particular reason why you picked baby blue?
No, I just liked the color.
Okay.
I used to have a Dodge Charger that was baby blue when I lived in California.
And I remember you used to have the Animal, the drummer from the Muppets, painted on at least one of those cars, if not a few of them.
I had the Animal painted on a few cars, and every car I owned had Tweety Bird painted on it.
Okay, why did you have those cartoon characters?
The Tweety Bird was for my sister Jenny.
Okay.
And the Animal, it was just something that struck me as the kids in the grandstands would like.
Okay.
It was kind of like trying to make it to where kids on picture night and stuff would want to come to your car.
Yeah, I remember on the hood of that 175 Nova, you had a big, huge painting of an animal. I thought that was so cool. Okay, so then after I should back up a bit. After the baby blue ones, then you actually built some Camaro 6 cylinders, and that's when you went orange and white.
Yes.
I think you had Country Kitchen on the side of it, maybe for a sponsor.
Yep.
I remember.
Yep. That was one of my first sponsors on the race car that you could build your own bodies on. But they had to somewhat resemble factory bodies.
And there is a guy by the name of John Carter who is on the Vintage Racing page, and he had just recently stated that he had bought both of your Novas from you when he got, I don't know if when he got into racing, but when you sold them, he bought them from you, and he had commented that they were very nice, well-built cars, and I remember that as all your equipment was always top-notch, well-built, well-maintained. Did you build all that stuff, most of it yourself then, back in the earlier days?
All of the cars that I ever raced, other than the modified, we built the cars ourselves.
I remember.
And that was built in our garage, just with welders and pipe benders, and
whatever you
instead
had,
of notching pipe with notchers, we ground every pipe. And
I remember your cars were always very well built, well maintained. So then you ended up running a late model then for 1 year.
1 year I ran a late model, yes.
And
a maroon Rayburn chassis, I believe.
And I think someone was saying you might have bought that from Bobby Girardi when Girardi was thinking about going back into racing and had that car, and then ended up selling it to you.
Yes, that's where I got it.
So then you only did that 1 year. Did that just prove to be too expensive, or what was the story there?
Yeah, it was late models compared to the 6-cylinder. Late model was probably twice the price to run at the time.
Okay. So now you also served as car owner then for many years.
Yes.
Pretty much all modifieds then as being a car owner.
My career as a car owner and not the driver, they were all modifieds, yes.
And you built that first one yourself.
Yes, sir.
And you had your brother Steve drive that car.
My brother Steve drove the car for me, and we ran a big block in that car, and Bob Espy, or Shaddy Holman, built the engine for that.
Built you your Chrysler.
The 454s.
Why did you hang up the wheel as being a driver?
I had back surgery, 2 back surgeries, and I couldn't drive any longer.
Okay.
Which was fine because I really enjoyed the owning and versus the driving. I mean, I enjoyed driving. I had some good times out there driving, racing against Tim Colliard, and I had a horn in my car, and I'd beep when I went by.
Really?
We had a grappling hook we passed back and forth every week, whoever won it. So I mean, we had good times driving.
Some good camaraderie then.
But I actually enjoyed the owning more than the driving.
Okay. So then you had Steve drive that first modified that you built for a few years.
Yes.
But then you had Jay Kittner drive it for a year or so after Steve stopped driving that car.
Yep.
And then when Jay drove that car, that's when you had that station wagon roof and kind of a station wagon body on it.
Right after.
Okay.
Steve drove for the first 2 years, I believe.
Okay.
And then after that, Jay had helped me since he was like 10 years old in the pits, scraping mud, and it was just his turn to drive.
Okay. Why did you go with the station wagon body that 1 year? What was the...
It was different. Nobody had one.
At that time. But then you and your car and Tim Carlson's car both had wagon bodies that year, I believe.
I don't think Tim Carlson had a wagon body.
Yep, he did. I'm pretty sure.
He may have, but I don't remember anybody else having a station wagon body.
Well, I was trying to...
I know Tim Colliard or Tim Carlson had bought my 6-cylinders from me.
Yeah, your orange and white 6-cylinders.
And I don't think he wasn't running modifieds at the time.
Okay, well...
He was running 6-cylinders.
That's a debate for another day, I guess. So then, after you had that wagon car, you traded that in for a DNS chassis.
Or a DNS chassis out of North Dakota, yes.
Yeah. And then you guys raced that for like 3 or 4 years.
We ran the DNS chassis for Actually, we finished my racing owning career in a DS chassis or a copy of one.
Mm-hmm. And you had Jay drive that one.
Jay drove that. Jay drove for me right up until 1994 when I quit racing.
So as far as being a car owner, then I remember when your brother Steve drove, you guys won Labor Day one year with the car that you guys built with the big block Chrysler. You had a Chrysler and a big block Chevy.
There's a big block 454 Chevy in that.
But Steve ended up getting the win for Labor Day one year.
Yes.
That was an interesting circumstance. What happened there?
Steve actually finished second behind Rick Auckland, but I believe Rick Auckland did not weigh at the end of the race, so he was disqualified. So Steve ended up getting the win.
Okay.
And I believe he actually gave Rick Auckland the trophy because he knew he didn't win it.
But still, it must have felt pretty good.
Oh yeah, it felt really good to see him. He ran the top groove. He was he was hanging his tires over the edge, and he was passing people left and right, and came from quite a way back to get up to Rick Auckland and caught him right at the end.
And even if Auckland won the race, finishing second to him is...
finishing second to
quite
Rick
a feat.
Auckland was quite an accomplishment for a Hibbing boy.
And then, as far as having Jay drive one of your mods, you guys won the point championship in Hibbing and in Bemidji the last year you raced, right?
In 1994, we won the point championship in Hibbing, Minnesota, and we also won point championship in Bemidji, Minnesota.
And I think back in those days, there was more stock given to winning a point championship.
To win a point championship back in the mid '90s, it was all based on what you knew, how much you put into your car as far as work, and not so much what you could buy for it.
And I think people put more importance on it back then. These days, there's so many specials. People bounce around to these different tracks. They don't stay at their home track every night.
Right.
So, typically who wins points these days is someone who raced there every night.
Right.
Back in those days, nobody did as much traveling on a weekend until the invitational season. So it just seemed like people strived and worked all year to win that point championship.
And it was, of course, it was the time that I was racing, but the people we raced against, and a few of them are still racing today, were Kelly Esty and Alan Olafson and Tim Jackson. And there was some real good drivers in those days.
Yeah, that was some heavy competition.
And Kelly Esty's still driving, and he's one of the best that's ever come out of Hibbing. But we beat him that year, and that was quite an accomplishment. Him and Alan Olafson, and there were some good races in those days.
And then you ended up buying a Bullet late model at the end of '94.
I sold my modified to Jeff Wood. And I sold all my modified equipment to him, and I went out and I bought a brand new Bullet chassis out of Marshfield, Wisconsin, and that sat in my garage for 2 years, and I never did race it.
And just one thing after led to another, and you never did race it.
And I had all of the tires or rims, and I bought all the spare rims, all the spare shocks, I had every part for that Bullet that they made, but I just never raced it.
But then you ended up selling. Jay ended up buying that car from you a few years later.
I sold that car after a couple of years of sitting in my garage to Jay, and Jay drove it. And I believe he did rather well in it the first year.
Yeah, he raced that car in '98 and '99 and 2000.
Yep, and I think he did rather well in it.
Yep, did okay for a new guy in a late model.
But that Bullet chassis, that was the chassis that Rick Auckland was driving at the time.
Yep.
And that's why we went with a Bullet.
Okay. All right. Well, this concludes part 1 of our interview with Dave Vesel. Please stay tuned for part 2.